Welcome back, everyone, to RoomPack's ResEdChat podcast. If you're new to the show, every episode we feature a variety of topics of interest to hire professionals who work in and with university housing, residence life, residential education, whatever you might call it. All are welcome here. Obviously, residential life operations and just the entire unit. There's a lot of facets, a lot of nuance, a lot of folks working in that kind of functional area and with it. So we're obviously just trying throughout all of our episodes to really highlight the diverse work of folks that are working in residence life, housing, operations, all the above. And we are focusing today's episode on housing operations. So we have our guest here, Zach, talking about building a modern housing unit at an institution. So, and focusing really into that sort of operational piece, because I think we'll even kind of break down sort of some of the vernacular here of how we're sort of differentiating all of that nuanced work that happens. It's not just, in the halls doing the programming, doing the student support, what goes into sort of creating the structures for making that magic happen. So, Zach, if you want to introduce yourself, give a brief introduction of your background and your current role at Wake Forest University.
Sure. Thanks, Dustin. Thanks for having me. Again, my name is Dr. Zach Blackmon. I have the pleasure of currently serving as the Associate Director of Operations here at Wake Forest University down in North Carolina. I've been at Wake Forest since 2013. For those who might be unfamiliar, Wake is a private liberal arts institution in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We are a 6-semester residential requirement school, so the majority of our students do live on campus with us, and we continue to partner very intentionally with our students who move off campus on how to be good community members and neighbors to our permanent residents that surround our campus. My career, like many, began in residence life, but then quickly realized that kind of the operational work was where I thrived and what I enjoyed most. And so I had the chance to create and then kind of grow an operations function in our department, focused on kind of process coordination and folding some other things into that, which we'll talk about. So currently my unit includes our assignments team, which manages, housing assignments, meal plan administration, and off-campus student services, as well as our operations team, which focuses on customer service, marketing and communications, and that process coordination. So.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, again, yeah, there's like obviously a lot that goes into it. And it can all vary by the institution of how they kind of just, what umbrella they put things like, meal plans or something else like that. I feel like that kind of stuck out to me. It was like, oh, interesting. But just to really kind of at the beginning here, at the outset, defining kind of the terms here, like what do you feel like is emblematic of a modern housing unit? And obviously, like, I think part of that breaks down sort of like assignments and operations and some of the other, kind of administrative stuff that happens, within housing residence life. But yeah, how would you kind of define a modern housing unit?
You hit the nail on the head, right? That, like, everywhere looks at this a little bit differently. I would say within a housing and residence life or residential education department, you're generally going to have kind of your residence life, residence education, resident success, whatever you call it, staff that work in halls directly with students, doing programming, doing conduct, the people, right? You're going to perhaps have a housing facilities team who are kind of the sticks and bricks people taking care of the buildings, keeping the lights on, overseeing custodial or maintenance, depending on your setup. And then you have operations, right? Which I always lovingly joke is like the other duties as assigned of a department. And so, housing assignments, marketing and communications, those are things that you might typically see there. But then depending on your campus, you may see meal plans, you may see your ID card service, you may see any other kind of thing kind of plugged in under a housing operations unit. And so for me, it's important as we think about what a modern unit looks like is the ability to be adaptive to today's students and today's leadership, right? So what are students wanting from the university, as well as what are your senior leaders on campus expecting from, the residential experience, from the business aspect of a housing unit, right? In my side of the shop, I am making sure that we keep our beds full so that we can pay our bills and keep the lights on and fun programming and so forth. Realizing that, for me, it's important, and I talk with my team a lot about that it is fair for our students and families to have expectations, right? And they should have expectations of their residential experience. You you, I, any of us have expectations for where we live, right? Whether that's what you're paying in rent or what your mortgage payment is, that comes with expectations. And so it's hard sometimes for our students to tease out, here at Wake, cost of attendance is just over $91,000 a year this year. That's going to come with a level of expectations. And our students and families don't tease out how much of that is actually going to housing versus tuition, et cetera. They know they're paying Wake Forest $91,000 a year. So those things are important to me. I think also thinking about, we know today's generation is all about like instant gratification, right? Amazon has made everything so streamlined and easy, and you can click through and it'll be there next day or 2 days or whatever. And so I always think about from a housing operations perspective, we're the folks who sometimes can help bring that level of service to a campus, right? Because if we can design streamlined processes that make housing related things easy for our students, we can increase their satisfaction there. And then just being open to change. One of the things you'll hear me talk about as we go on through this episode is the ways in which our team and unit have morphed over time, and you've got to be open to that change to see those opportunities and then seize on them.
Really great to hear that, because I think that idea of, like you said, like all these sort of other duties as assigned is like, well, they they get a bad rap, but at a certain point, it's like those are things that need to happen, that need to be done, and it's like, starting to build sort of the expertise or the ability and time to like focus on those things that do require or kind of deserve, sort of earnest focus, and then that idea of kind of like, increasingly, I think has become kind of just much more exposed, I guess, of like that business side of higher ed, and certainly like, residence life and housing and all that as a revenue generator, and just being mindful of occupancy and sort of how yeah, just all the budget side of everything is working, because that's obviously like, that's programming money, that's uh money for just like retaining and uh just supporting like staff members and things like that. Like there's just so many kind of ramifications of making sure that those things are aligned, and like the way that you maintain a high level of occupancy is like, satisfaction, like, and really being kind of uh just honest with yourselves, I guess, like you're saying. It's like, okay, these students are making this investment, like, and they have expectations, and let's be uh making every stride that we can to be living up to those expectations. And that idea of like, that you uh, are building a unit where, like, if students are having demands about like, one thing or another, it's like, okay, like, this is my job, is to do this. Like, it's not like some other duty is assigned to somebody else. Like, I can be hopefully pretty responsive and give good service and everything to that. So I guess, could you like just elaborate a little bit on that, like that aspect of like, okay, I'm the one that's sort of maybe monitoring the occupancy and everything, and the way that we obviously achieve that is like the satisfaction, like that sort of like service component, I guess, that you are trying to strive towards for your unit.
Yeah, and I think this is something that can vary campus to campus, right? Again, like I mentioned, Wake Forest has a 6 semester residency requirement. So while a lot of our students have to live with us, we want them to want to live with us, right? We want it to be that they want to be here, not that they feel forced to be here. I have peers at institutions that have no residency requirement, right? And so they really are relying on that desire and that sell to keep their beds full. And for us, I mean, you mentioned it, Dustin, but like, we are the backbone to a department, and in some cases, other offices as well, right? So like, at a smaller institution like Wake, like, we are not a true auxiliary, so our money is funding the general university fund, and then we're getting an operating budget back, right? And so it's, if we don't meet revenue expectations, it has implications for the broader university, not just our office. And if you're a true auxiliary and you don't meet revenue expectations and you can't pay all of the bills, then what are you cutting, right? And so it really is both the service and keeping people happy, as well as the very intentional and kind of data driven planning that our kind of occupancy management professionals do to make sure that we can keep our beds as full as possible in healthy ways, right? And I can talk a little bit later on about like how do you find that blend of, you know, again, at an institution that charges what Wake does, I can't run at 102% occupancy. That's not a realistic reality for me, but I can run at 98 and still keep people happy.
Yeah, that's a good acknowledgement. I think like because I've been in institutions where like that almost seems like that's like a requirement is like, oh no, we need to like overdrive, and that's the way that we're going to be able to like sustain ourselves. And it's like, well, that like you're sort of sacrificing, and I think that's like what was sort of ringing in my head is like that idea of what is going to serve us and making sure that that is uh not counterweighting too much on that sort of service component, the resident experience and everything. Because it'd be that idea like, oh man, wouldn't it be great if we were at 110 occupancy, whatever, 110% occupancy? And it's like, okay, you are clearly going to be like making a pretty major sacrifice to that resident experience where it's like you're being served great, like everything's amazing from your perspective, in a very logical kind of way, but on that sort of like emotional satisfaction piece and everything, it's like, right, like you're sort of like, it's that sort of like burning very hot but very quick kind of thing. It's like, yeah, you could do that, but like eventually people are going to be like, eye in the door a bit, I guess, sort of like, well, this isn't worth it. Like I'm not going to, endure this and my living experience because yeah, like you're saying, that's such a like kind of uh just any of us can very much empathize, I think, with like having expectations around our living accommodations and everything. So I think and I guess what's kind of coming up to my mind as we're kind of segueing to the next question is like that idea of, most institutions are probably going to have a person or many people who are like the assignments people, and then the residence life, coordinators and everything. And sometimes it feels like there may be um somewhat of a gap between them because it's kind of like functionally very different and maybe just like transactional or something. With you kind of building this like modern housing operations unit that I feel like is, what I'm sort of uh, guessing, I guess, from what you're saying, is sort of like really bringing all of that maybe more in line with each other. But can you speak to just like the strides that have been happening at Wake Forest to kind of accomplish that, like building that truly modern housing operation units? And I'm curious, maybe if you can also like sprinkle in any of the sort of like technology tools, maybe if there's anything that has sort of like helped to facilitate some of those things. But I guess just generally, if it's just sort of like structural, organizational, kind of pieces, whatever kind of comes to mind.
There are a variety of ways that we can be structured, and I think how you structure things communicates things, right? In terms of what's valued, how is partnership expected, etc. And so, when I started in 2013, our office didn't have an operations unit, right? As an entry level professional, I was also helping coordinate move in, doing project relocations within my communities when they were going under renovation, and running a third of our campus, right? Like that was the scope of my work. And so as we continued to grow, we had the opportunity to say, hey, some of these things need to be centralized so that we can help all of the units within our office work together, we are a centralized facilities and campus services model on our campus, so they service the entire campus. So we have a very close kind of partnership with them, but they are not in our office. So how do we work with them? How do we work in camps and conferences, which are a different office on our campus, those kind of things. And so for me, it was thinking about you have to find that balance, right? Of, while there was some intentionality and alignment of having assignments as a part of our residence life team, it also wasn't serving necessarily the business side in the ways it needed to at sometimes, right? And so when as we grew staff, as we grew, our campus community, as we shifted from graduate level staff in our halls to some professional master's level, entry level professionals, there was an opportunity to think about where did assignments make sense and what does that look like in partnership. And so, for me, one of the reasons that we wanted to create an operations area and then particularly fold assignments into that was to focus on logistics, streamline communications, have smooth processes that frequently we are having to partner with our colleagues in residence life to carry out, but we're taking some of that administrative burden off of them to let them focus on student care and well-being and support, right, rather than administrivia. And so, room changes are a great example. We have a far too robust Google spreadsheet that we track all of our room changes and departures and such on, but that is something that my team uses, our housing team uses in terms of the physical aspects of is the room ready to be reused, do we have the key, etc. And our residence life team are the ones saying, yeah, we've confirmed that the room is actually empty or the student actually moved out. Well, they moved out, but there's a hole in the wall, those kind of things. And so that requires all three units of our office to collaborate around that process of making sure a student did vacate and then is that room ready for use again. Um, so, I think for me, when we think about the technology piece, I know you asked about that. I mean, I think it's continuing to think about, we are a Star Res campus. Most of our campuses at this point are, but how do you use whatever housing software you have, but also recognizing that like they are not the end all be all, right? Like if there was one software that could do everything for all of us, they would just run the market. But so how do you pair things together to best serve your campus? So for us, there are some things that like could we build a process in StarRes for room changes and departures and so forth? Yes. We would find it more cumbersome than just using an efficient Google Sheet on our campus. And so it's thinking about what best serves the need for each kind of task.
Well, and here's like a quick follow-up, I think, just for what you're saying. Like, one, it's sort of like refreshing kind of that idea of like, because there's maybe like the spectrum of like, yeah, it's the idea of like, okay, we could try to like shoehorn and do like all this sort of like labor to figure out like how to use this one tool to try to make it to be that sort of like golden goose that just like, is perfect and gets, whatever, it does all the things all the time and whatever. It's just one place. And there's certainly some value in that. But then I think like, the other end of the spectrum would be there is no process at all in the sense of like every residence hall coordinator or whatever, like for each of their halls is doing their own thing to track their changes, whatever. Was that the case that you felt like, well, we need to do something better? So the middle ground is just sort of like creating a very robust, like spreadsheet and form that obviously with like Google Drive is able to be collaboratively accessed and everything. Like, did you at least sort of graduate from like, just sort of ad hoc, everybody doing it independently and all that? Like, was that sort of like the before? Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say definitely there was more, pre 2016, right? So when I transitioned over into operations was also kind of when we transitioned from graduate students in hall and like an area coordinator model to community directors and having, we went from 3 to 7 kind of entry level staff members in residence life. And so with that was also, yeah, I think a time when it was like, okay, we can't let 7 of you all do it the way you want and us get 7 different responses and formats and things back, right? And we ran a couple processes, I think housing inspections is a good example of this too, where, there was probably a year or two where we let some different areas run it different and it was hard on my team getting like 7 different looking spreadsheets back and then having to make sense of them to do billing and so forth. And so yes, I think there's a delicate balance, and this is something that I spend a lot of time in partnership with the leadership in our residence life unit on is like what are the things that really matter for us to give entry level staff, whether that's on my side or their side, autonomy about, and what are those things that we need to just be a little more directive about for consistency's sake.
Well, yeah, and I think that that's a good kind of folks are taking notes. I feel like that's a good one to, to note down. Pause, replay, whatever. But like the idea of an upgrade or sort of like the idea of improving processes can, and I'm sure this is going to just hopefully be affirming to a lot of folks. I'm sure this has been the route that a lot of folks have taken, but like the idea of creating a Google sheet that is comprehensive and user friendly and uniform and sort of everybody's like using the same kind of process and everything, like that elevates what you're doing to become a bit more of a modern housing operations unit and everything. So I think even just that idea of looking at uh, how you become more modern, how you kind of innovate and improve can be sort of these sort of iterative, marginal, like, kind of the game of inches where it is just the idea of like, we know that we want to, be more efficient with the way that we're tracking room changes and all that. Like, it doesn't have to be getting to that like perfect ideal state because it's like, well, that could probably take us like who knows, like maybe a couple of years to get to that point. It's like we need to try to like, especially I think in this moment and in this climate, like, find those efficiencies, find those sort of benefits and everything as quickly as possible. And I think just trying to at least just really encourage folks that it's like, start now with something. Like I come up with that, that comes up to my mind when a lot of these conversations I'm having in so many different areas is that like, um, it can feel sort of overwhelming to uh and that, that it's sort of like toxic, perfectionism and all that, where it's just like, well, it's got to be just so, it's got to be just right, and we got to like, test it and test it, or like, keep searching for the best, perfect tool out there that's going to do all the things we want, all in one or whatever. So I think, yeah, that's just for me something that's kind of resonating. And I think to kind of, segue to my next question, the idea of like the challenges that you faced, because I guess what I'm thinking of is that a common challenge that maybe you have faced, or I'm sure a lot of others have, is like, obviously just like the lack of resources, where it'd be like, well, yeah, I mean, I would love to be able to build a custom platform and this, and, have it be, super sophisticated or whatever. But it's like, you know what? We need something. We're going to make this Google sheet, and it's going to like, like sometimes, especially if you set them up very well, like a Google sheet could do some pretty amazing things. So it's like, so I think that idea of like, if you've had to kind of be sort of scrappy, with like kind of a lean budget, but still try to build a more modern housing operations unit and everything. Like, can you reflect on some of the like the challenges and how you've dealt with them, or like how you've maybe like learned from mistakes as you've like built a team there over the past several years?
Yeah, I think, I mean, certainly I want to kind of back up real quick and say that, yes, like, absolutely. I think, higher education overall struggles with this idea of like perfectionism and like when is the right time to do something and so forth. And so, like, I always stress for my team, like, we should always be in a growth mindset, right? And so, like you said, do something and then evaluate how that worked and what you might want to tweak or improve. But like, we never change, we're never improving. And the one thing we know is like our students are always changing. And so if we're not changing with them, then we're falling behind. So, I mean, I think process wise, another example I'll give is occupancy verification or kind of resident verification. Dustin, you probably remember the days, and they weren't too long ago here that like, RAs had papers and every student had to sign a paper that they were here and they were living where they were supposed to be and so forth. And, you know, I guess this was probably 20, it might have been like 2017, 2018. I don't remember exactly. It was before COVID, so it becomes a blur. um, we had a conversation in our office about like, what is this process actually achieving for us, right? What is the goal of it? And then, what were some of the challenges that were coming up, right? People either weren't doing it or RAs were taping rosters to their doors, which presented, information and privacy concerns, et cetera. And so we did away with paper and we came up with a process through StarRes on our housing portal that is like self-driven by the student to say, yes, I've moved into the right room, right? And we put the onus on them to say, this is your one chance to report that you all did something funky and changed rooms, and we'll just fix it in our system. So I think there are ways to say like, what is outdated and not serving us, and then what is the solution, right? I think in all of this, like, you're gonna navigate challenge and you're gonna make mistakes. I think for me, one of the reflections that I frequently give when I'm talking about my unit is like, our current structure came out of challenge, right? Coming out of COVID, I was a new associate director slash assistant director with an interim assistant director title, um, managing 5 to 6 frontline staff, but yet still also being asked to do high level strategy work around occupancy planning and forecasting and processes and so forth. And it just was not working, right? I wasn't able to do both well. Our frontline staff weren't getting the support they needed, so they weren't serving our students well. And so when we had a couple staff members leave around the same time, I took that opportunity rather than like rush and throw a position description up to look at the team holistically and say, what do we need? Because I think one of the things that, sometimes we get so wrapped up in like, oh, I need more money. Like, I'm going to have to ask for more money. That's going to have to go into a budget cycle. It'll be 18 months before I can get it, etc. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just need to organize your roles differently, right? And whether that's changing levels or simply reorganizing work, there's time to do that. So that was kind of how we approached things was, you know, took that moment when we had several vacancies on our team, reorganized, put some roles together, and then move forward from there with what positions did we need to fill. Again, similar to a process, it is okay to not get your team right away, right? Like, we have one role in particular on my team that I think we're on the third or fourth version of now because we continue to tweak it because it's like, okay, And it's not about the role being wrong. It's about figuring out, the other thing for me as a leader in my office is that sense of stewardship around, like, if I have an FTE devoted to something, am I getting an FTE worth of work out of that person? So, we continue to work through that with some of our roles. And so for me, it's that piece of always being open to take that moment and look at the landscape and know how you might want to rearrange things. And then I think being aware that, for so many of us, you're going to get promoted based on solid performance as an individual contributor, right? And then you're suddenly leading people in a team. And so knowing how to delegate is critical for yourself. And so if that is not something that is a natural skill of yours, I would challenge folks to get comfortable with it, lean into kind of what is not yours, right? I frequently have to think about this for myself, and now how do I support kind of the mid managers that report to me on, like, why are you holding XYZ? That should really be your frontline staff.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective because I think it is like kind of what I was getting at, where my mind was going, was that idea of like, limited budget, or yeah, there's like budgeting cycles and stuff. And that sometimes it's just like squashing people's sort of ideation or sort of brainstorming, where it's just like, oh my gosh, yeah, like you said, like, oh, this is going to take like so long to get through or whatever. Or like we know that like there's just not the resources there, but like kind of like flipping the script and being like, well, like, people are like part of sort of our budget and our resources and sort of like the powers, the superpowers that we have. And so like, how can we try to like reorient those in terms of just like, okay, well, let's look for somebody that has a different skill set when we're like recruiting for an opening, or could we try to like, tap the folks that we have, and that would sort of inform like, okay, well, if we utilize this person's skill sets or interest in a certain way, that means that that opening we recruit for something different than what we kind of had anticipated, if we're simply like backfilling the prior opening. So yeah, like challenging those paradigms being really kind of healthy. And
Like you mentioned, and I'm going to caveat here, like, my team, you're great, love you, you all do great work. Humans are one of our resources, right? Like, for every human I have roughly 37 and a half hours of work. So if I'm not using those effectively, then what else could get done if we were, right? We have one role on our team. When we bought an apartment complex, we put an administrator over there because initially we were doing all the packages through a clubhouse and checking folks in and out there, et cetera. And then, COVID comes along and squashes all of that. And we decided not to bring some of that back after COVID. And so, at that point, it was like, okay, I have this person who has a job and we want to keep them a job, but what is their job now? And so, again, thinking creatively about the way we looked at that was, how do we provide some increased support to our off-campus students, right? Knowing that had been an area that we were continuing to get negative feedback from our neighbors and partners on. And so we were able to say, hey, look, we're actually putting more human resources towards this area that you're concerned about.
yeah, and I think yeah, it's like there's obviously like the shoe fits of like calling people like human resources. It's just like, no, it's like there's got to be a better term. And I was like thinking a little bit, it's like, I don't know, like people power or something. Like you've got certain like, right, yeah, like certain megawatts of power, and you can I was like, oh, we're not using the full power. You can like plug more in here, or something, I don't know. So please please send us your ideas for better terminology there. But yeah, I mean, I think that is like an important way to look at. And I think if you have the right team, obviously you just have to sort of approach that in the right way. But that idea that people want you know the opportunity to leverage their strengths and the challenges and sort of that feel sort of within their skill sets and to be contributing and all that, like so I think, yeah, I mean, as a leader of a modern housing unit, you do just have to be really uh thinking critically about all of the resources that you have, people and otherwise, and everything. So and speaking of resources, I thought it'd be good to, as we're wrapping up, give you the opportunity, if you have just any sort of closing final thoughts, bits of advice, and or resources that you'd want to share with folks on this topic that we can put in the show notes.
So I mean, I think like what you just said, right? As you move into leadership roles and, kind of particularly when you get to the point of having to start to think about an entire team or unit, like, I say, and it's my belief that, like, you should always be thinking about what is your team's next iteration, right? What could it look like next? Whether that's okay, hypothetically, this is not a Wake Forest statement, hypothetically, if your campus is going to be building in the next 2 years and growing its bed count, do you need another human to support that, right? If you know that you're getting a new vice president, what opportunities are presented there to present kind of different staffing structures, et cetera. So always be thinking about what could be next, whether that is reorganizing responsibilities to best use your current staff skill set, thinking about like, if you have a vacancy, again, I think far too frequently in higher ed, where it's just like, oh, I found the job description, post the job description, rehire the person, right? And so it's like, take a minute and think about, is that job what it needs to be? Are there pieces of that job that are actually better served by someone else on your team, and something that maybe isn't their strength that could go into that role? And also, starting to think about like, what is that next thing, right? So that allows you, the reason I say I think this is so important as a leader is this allows you to be ready and quick when those opportunities arise, right? And so when, your director, executive director, senior director, whatever title you have, comes to you and says, hey, our budget requests are due in 2 weeks, we need to know kind of what's on our wish list, you can say like, well, here's what I would love to do, and actually here's a position description I have drafted for it, and be ready to go. Whereas your colleague might also like another human, but it'll take them a month to put a position description together. Yours is probably going to make it into the budget, theirs may not. So always be thinking ahead. Keep things centered on taking care of your students and your staff, right? So for me, I always make the case for my staffing around how am I making sure that my frontline staff are supported so that they can best support our students and families. Because folks who don't feel supported themselves are not going to be able to give the best customer service, right? That's just, a reasonable understanding, I think. And so that's the way I try to keep things centered for me. Um, there is value in benchmarking, but I think one of the things Dustin said at the beginning of this is really important, particularly within kind of operations work, understanding that our units are very unique from campus to campus. So make sure that, you're looking at things that are actually like peer to peer, but know your institutional context, right? Know where you can contribute, know where you can bring value and help solve problems, right? So a great example I'll share in kind of closing is we have been working through a student information system transition on our campus that has created lots of opportunities, as my friend Aubrey Adams loves to call them. And so, I found, saw a gap that was emerging and told my AVP, like, hey, I think we might need a different committee. We have this high level group looking at kind of enrollment projection and making sure we're meeting enrollment goals for the institution, but we really need like a enrollment services group for all the offices that have to touch a student between admission and enrollment, right? And so, think about those things where you can bring value to the institution, because that's also then when you're going to get value returned to you when you need it.
Lots of great advice there. Dude, especially love that one about just like being prepared for that moment of being like, hey, like what's on your wish list? And like you are just like, you're able to pounce on that. I think that is such great advice, because I think that is emblematic of being very well plugged in to sort of your team, what's going on and all that, is that you're sort of like anticipating sort of like needs and all that, versus sort of, yeah, like being in that position where it's like, let me scratch my head and kind of like ponder and wonder and ask some people. It's like, oh no, I've been like engaging and asking and all that. And like, and that can be tough, because it's like, I think that is a great idea for us to do. I don't know when that might happen, but like, trust me when I say that, like, when that opportunity arises, we are going to be like in a really strong position to, to pitch that. So I think that that's like, yeah, such a great kind of practical piece of advice for folks for sure. And even just that acknowledgement too of like, as much as we might say about, you sharing kind of anecdotes from your experience, like it is, imperative for you to be, plugged in to your institution, to your kind of politics and dynamics and, goings on. And then like, obviously there's so many great communities out there for you to do that sort of peer, collaboration and kind of talking shop and everything. So I think, Yeah, always a time well spent to be engaging with those sort of colleagues and everything. So, um, but yeah, I think we'll wrap it up there. Again, I mean, that's such great advice, great perspectives, and just appreciate you so much for giving the time here and reflecting on your experience, ways to connect with you in the show notes, and yeah, it was a great time. Just really, I think, yeah, such a valuable topic. So I'm very glad that we were able to make this episode happen. Appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.